Part 1. Pitfalls of Prayer. The poet sings, "Hope springs eternal in the human breast." The reason is that every normal person has wishes and dreams of better things. Within every person, there is an intuitive sense of the transcendent, an inner knowledge that there is more to life than one is experiencing, and a yearning to unfold more of that more. No matter how realistic or humanistic we may be, we still look up. We have aspirations and dream impossible dreams that here and there have become possible. It is this sense of the transcendent that has lit the fires on every altar, built every temple and shrine, made every creed articulate, and supported every prayer through all history. It is the universe calling to human creatures, relentlessly urging them to come up higher. It is widely but erroneously believed that religion began with a complete conscious relationship with God, and then in the ages that followed, through weakness and sin, and through the supposed fall of man, we lost sight of that first splendid vision. This is a concept that prevails through much of our traditional religion, and it is one of the first religious ideas that the thinking person begins to question, even resist, finding it difficult to accept a theology that is essentially preoccupied with looking backward. Most religions look back to a golden age of their spiritual giants, a time when God walked the earth. The Jewish tradition looks back to the days of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Moses. Christianity looks backward to the days of Jesus and to the adventures in the writings of Paul. Thus, the traditionalists of religion invariably deal with worship in retrospect. Actually, the assembled records of archaeology and anthropology indicate a progressive evolution of culture and consciousness throughout all history, including biblical history. We have nothing to lead us to believe that this evolutionary flow suddenly stopped along the way. When we consider the primitive creatures in their worship of sticks and stones, we are not seeing evidence of religion in decay. We are seeing an early level of consciousness from which later and more elevated forms evolved. Primitive creatures were fire worshippers and sun worshippers. They were terribly insecure creatures, stricken with mortal fear of all the elements, who often created their own gods. But it would be incorrect to say that they did not pray. A kind of praying impulse was a part of the fiber of their being, a dim perception of their relationship with the universe. However dim or vague, there was that feeling that Longfellow articulates, that even in savage bosoms, there are longings, yearnings, strivings for the good they comprehend not. That the feeble hands and helpless, groping blindly in the darkness, touch God's right hand in that darkness and are lifted up and strengthened. One of the grave mistakes that we make in our study of primitive cultures of the far distant past, and even now in studying undeveloped parts of the world, is to refer to people as pagans. In the study of religion, the concept of paganism is an unfortunate one. Let's look at this word, understand it, and then make a commitment to eliminate it from our vocabulary. From our Christian or Jewish background, we have used the word pagan to mean non-believer, coming from a feeling that my God is the only God, and anyone who believes in any other God is stupid, thus a pagan. The word pagan comes from the same root as village and peasant. The word was originally used by a sophisticated city dweller in describing a person from a rural area, a hick from the sticks. Even before this, it was used in general reference to people who came from the country, the hill areas, hillbillies. In that period, Christianity was sweeping through the world in the predominantly urban areas. even as today, liberalism has its greatest support in urban centers and is slow to take hold in rural farm and ranch areas. So it was common in the early days of the spread of Christianity to refer to those people who came from the hinterlands and who were still holding to pre-Christian or non-Christian attitudes and practices as pagans. At best, this was unkind, and at worst, it was a dangerous root of prejudice and an ethnic slur. Much of this cultural put-down originated with the Christian missionaries, who labeled as pagans people in the cultures of Africa, China, India, and the native Indians in America. From the earliest of times, people have had a need to symbolize their sense of the transcendent. They have had an instinctive reverence for any power or powers that they believed might help or harm them. So when a bolt of lightning struck or killed a brother, they were possessed by a sudden fear of lightning, which in their primitive mind was interpreted as reverence. The lightning became a god. Soon, the primitive creatures built an altar to the new god, on which they made sacrifices of appeasement to prevent the lightning from doing them further harm. In earlier times, and even surprisingly in relatively sophisticated cultures, the sacrifice was in the form of human flesh. Later, the practice evolved into a mere symbolic gesture. We may have a more realistic understanding of the Bible if we note that the practice of human sacrifice as a form of the worship of Yahweh was still a strong memory as the Bible narrative burst upon the evolutionary scene. A glaring example is that instance where Abraham took his son Isaac up on the mountain with the intent of sacrificing his life to Yahweh. That he was dissuaded at the last moment from this act of human sacrifice should not blind us to the fact of its possibility in Abraham's culture at that time. Burnt offerings and animal flesh were a central part of temple worship all through the Old Testament. With lines of squealing lambs being led to slaughter, smoke burning the eyes, and obnoxious odors emanating from the ceremonies of worship, the house of God was not a very pleasant place to go for contemplation. Shocking as it may be to consider, the richly adorned altar of the modern church is the carryover of this veritable butcher block on which life was once slaughtered. Such is the evolution of a ritual. The Hebrew prophets cried out for reform. If you are interested, you might read Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 to 17. However, the slaughter of animals on the altar continued almost up to the time of Jesus. We can sense this in the view, articulated in prayer and song, that Jesus was the Lamb of God who was sacrificed at the altar of the Lord to take away the sins of mankind. It is the basis of that most hideous of Christian concepts, the vicarious atonement. It was and is an interesting commentary on the God concepts that did and do prevail. We must keep in mind that the gods, and later under Moses, the one God, evolved from human imagination. God was the symbol of the unknown, of an intuitive belief in a universe of law and order. And the Old Testament of the Bible is the chronicle of a slow evolution from the primitive anthropomorphic view of deity all the way up to Jesus' concept of a loving and tender presence that is ever present. Along the way, the God that was portrayed was wrathful and jealous and vindictive, giving life and taking it away with impunity, at times viciously destroying entire cities. For a liberal education in realism, read 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Out of this concept of God evolved the doctrine of God's will. God brings trouble and even death to us, supposedly for some inscrutable reason he has. Thus, if only we can get God's ear and prove our penitence through offerings and sacrifices, our fervent plea may be heard and our prayers answered. At least this is what we have been taught. Elaborate prayer doctrines have been built on this structure of confusion of God and the nature of the universe. The healing idea in Protestantism is usually dealt with under the label of intercessory prayer. It implies that one must plead with God to attain healing, implying that he has either willed the condition or at least acquiesced in it. So, through pleading and bargaining, we hope that God may have second thoughts, saying, well, I guess John is sincere in his penitence, and he does seem worthy. I will take a chance on him. I will heal him. We may wonder, too, how all our complicated rituals came about. The church all but insists that these are set down by God. If we look to earlier times, we see that prayer for the primitive creatures was unstudied and spontaneous. Often, it was a simple outcry of the human heart, seeking help and protection, reaching for something more. We see this colorfully demonstrated in the Native American who went alone to a high hill and with his head imperilously held high, looked out into the vastness of the heavens with outstretched arms, in a kind of embrace of the whole universe. His prayer was unstudied, spontaneous, wordless. No incantation, no ritual, no repetition of words. In some way, he had a subconscious feeling of the wholeness of things. Perhaps he sensed with Gibran that prayer is the expansion of oneself into the living ether. Prayer and worship became formalized, ritualized, but not as a more effective means of communication with God. It was rather because of the trend toward specialization in urban societies. In any tribal organization, individuals were assigned special duties, one of which was the role of the medicine man or tribal priests, whose duty it was to keep the evil spirits away. Thus, while the others went off hunting or waging war, the designated person, the holy man, remained behind to keep the purifying fires and to scatter the magic dust on the ground. With obvious modifications, we can see this system at work under Moses' leadership of the Israelites in the wilderness. The completely disorganized mass of ex-slaves was formed into 12 tribes. One of the tribes, the Levites, was designated as the priestly tribe. Actually, since the government being formed was the theocracy, the Levites became the bureaucracy, with the tithes and offerings to the temple representing a form of taxation. We can see this practice of specialization today in the minister or priest or rabbi who was given the responsibility to do the praying. It is something like having a lobbyist in Congress. The clergyman is the lobbyist with God, pleading your case, interceding with the divine will. The clergyman is the prayer specialist. So a lay person who prays at all simply uses the formal prayers, incantations, or even affirmations furnished by the minister. This is seen at its most ludicrous when someone comes to a spiritual counselor for prayer help, outlines the problem, and then, possibly dropping a contribution on the desk, says, "Take care of it for me, will you?" It is a serious point. Let's think about it. Another person can't breathe for you, nor do the praying for you in the sense that it is something extraneous to you, any more than I, if I were a physical culturist, could exercise your lungs for you. I may help you to understand the breathing process so that you can learn how to breathe more efficiently for yourself. But you make the difference. And so it is with prayer. Prayer is an individual experience, a matter of understanding your whole self. In chapter 10, we deal at length with the process of praying for others, making clear that our prayers may help to create an environment in which the other person can more easily release their own inner power. But in the end, the responsibility for that release is still their own. People talk of saying their prayers. The words may be read from a prayer book or recited from memory. A typical source of prayers formulated for contemporary use centuries ago is the Book of Common Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer may be repeated by rote in a rapid delivery of words that have, for most people, lost their meaning, if not their place in personal devotion. In physics, we are told that action and reaction are equal. If prayer is the action, and that action consists of mere recitation of words or the unfeeling performance of a ritual, then the reaction is also quite likely to be ineffective. Little wonder that many thinking people question the validity of the practice of prayer as a reasonable approach to life experiences. Prayer, for most of us, playing out the traditional worship practices that have evolved from tribal rituals of antiquity, may be something we hurl at God. It may be a performance put on for eyes and ears other than our own. It is important for every person to make a careful examination of their own personal God concept. This means honestly and courageously stepping back from the liturgy, even the Mass of one's church. It doesn't have to mean an act of rebellion against the faith of our fathers. Rather, it means that we need to discover ourselves as individual expressions of the universe, and to know that there is a kind of personal prayer that is turning within, knowing our oneness with the source, and through affirmation, not supplication, giving way to the creative process. We can't let our grandfather do our thinking or praying for us. You may think that you have a good understanding of God as spirit, and with Emerson, you insist upon having a first-hand and immediate experience of God. And yet, when you pray, either silently or in public, you may act out of your childhood perceptions, talking to God, reaching out and up to God, bargaining, supplicating. Emerson challenges us to break with the God of tradition, that God may fire us with his presence. It may be startling to you to hear it, but both the scriptures and the historical church deal with an absence of God, a worship in retrospect. This may explain the deep feelings of perplexity, even futility in the praying person. You don't discover God in your worship in the church. You uncover God in yourself, even if by the inspiration of the moving liturgy. But the important thing is, you do not leave God there in the sanctuary. You take him with you, and he will be with you in the street, in your home, in your work, and in every activity of your life. Discover God's presence. God is an allness in which you exist as an eachness. As I say in the book, discover the power within you. God is not in you in the same sense that a raisin is in a bun. That is not unity. God is in you as the ocean is in a wave. The wave is nothing more or less than the ocean expressing as a wave. In his De Vile Milieu, Teilhard de Chardin says that we come to a place where there is no one to bow down to and worship, not even within ourselves. And as we get a greater perception of our relation to the universe, there is no one to pray to, only a universal flow to get into, a spiritual energy to pray from. And the role of prayer is the projection by our words and feelings of this divine flow, this powerful spiritual energy that goes forth to accomplish that for which it is sent. The science of prayer is not a technique for getting into God or for getting God into us. School yourself on this point. It is the awareness of our true self in its largest possible context, and the key to changing things by altering our self-limiting attitudes. What the history of prayer may fail to reveal to us is that there is a secret place at the heart of us where the Father and I are one. It is this that Jesus had in mind when he said, "Enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." Matthew 6, verse 6, King James Version. Prayer is the secret door to cosmic power. Prayer is the secret door to cosmic power, not a liturgical rubric bound to ancient tradition, but a consciousness rooted in the here and now. So prayer is not something we do to God or a ceremony we perform for God. It is an experience of our own God potential. As this book unfolds, we will stress the idea again and again that we do not really pray to God. Rather, we pray from a consciousness of God. Prayer is not conditioning God with our needs, but conditioning our lives with the activity of God. Prayer is self-realization, self-expansion. It is getting recentered within and reestablishing ourselves in the flow of the infinite creative process. There have been so many powerful realizations of the presence of God and the withinness of prayer in the writings of poets, saints, and mystics down through the ages that one wonders, how could we have failed to grasp it, holding tenaciously to the anthropomorphic concept of God sitting up there on a billowy cloud with a long white beard and a big black book. Significant are the lines of Wordsworth, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns and the round ocean and the living air and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all object of all thoughts, and rolls through all things.